When you think about an Invisible Man antagonist, we're sure the 2000s movie Hollow Man definitely crosses your mind. And how could it not? Starring Kevin Bacon as a brilliant scientist who comes undone with his own invisible power and massive ego, along with the big budget effects and unmistakable stamp of Paul Verhoeven, this movie seemed like a new movement in the science fiction genre. Everyone was sure that there would be more movies to follow because this movie just had that vibe, but after a forgettable sequel and no follow-up in decades since, Hollow Man has become nothing but a strange footnote in early 2000s cinema, so you gotta wonder, what the hell happened to the Hollow Man? Before we get into our explanation, we have a very small request. If you like our content, please support us by subscribing to the channel. It's a small click for you, but for us, it means a lot. Thank you. Let's begin. When this movie debuted in August 2000, trust us when we say this was everything. It had high-concept spectacle, horror, and sci-fi. It had a budget of $95 million, $50 million of which was completely dedicated to special effects. Handled by Sony Pictures Imageworks and Tippett Studio, this film was a technological spectacle and fascinated everyone who saw it. The premise of the movie was also extremely solid. You have a biologist, Sebastian Cain, played by Kevin Bacon, who developed a serum that would render its subject invisible. Since mad scientists got a mad scientist, he basically decides to volunteer himself for the experiment. And sure, the serum makes him invisible real quick, but the reversal of the serum didn't work, and Cain devolves into a dangerous and mentally unstable predator. When it comes to the visuals, this movie was a revelation. The transformation scene, where we see Cain's body disappearing layer by layer, from skin to muscle, organs to skeleton, is still iconic. This scene was created by using proprietary tools like Muscle Shader, which was developed after extensive research. They watched dissection footage and anatomy consults to ensure the anatomy was absolutely perfect. Greg Anderson from Sony explained this tedious process in many interviews. There were about 560 visual effects shots made by SPI and Tippett Studios, and the team employed motion control cameras, actor composites, and body scanning to ensure that Bacon's full anatomy was reflected with the effects to build up the coherence. Now, imagine the movie audience at the time. They had just gotten The Matrix. The audience was hungry for next-level visuals, and Hollow Man served them exactly what they were waiting for. Critics couldn't look away. The scene was that exceptionally well crafted. Every critic had to admire its technical mastery, even if they found flaws in other aspects of the movies. In fact, this movie was nominated for an Oscar. Yup, Best Visual Effects. Unfortunately, it lost to Gladiator, a decision everyone feels was overrated because Hollow Man was more technically daring. Kevin Bacon's casting was another big reason why this movie worked. Bacon can smoothly shift between charm and menace, and that's why, as we watch Cain's descent into malevolence, it feels real. The performance carried the film's darker themes on its back and made Sebastian Cain extremely memorable. From the moment Cain started abusing his power to harass and terrorize people, he was too far gone, and we love that. We love when films raise ethical questions that we have to face head-on. And when the movie released, Hollow Man grossed over $190 million worldwide. Double the production budget. Now that sounds profitable, but the reality is much more complex. Marketing and distribution costs consumed much of that profit, effectively leaving the studios with limited profit. But overall, the film's financial success justified the discussions of developing a franchise. You know how Hollywood works. Whenever there's money to be made, they'll be there in a second looking for it. But all of those hopes kind of crash-landed when you considered the critical reception of the film. Critically speaking, the movie Hollow Man was a niche film. It was spectacular and frightening, and it was a summer movie that was high on visuals and low on narration. Audiences watched, yes, and this movie ended up in the cultural memory as a cautionary tale and not a beloved classic. Something you don't want to happen when you're trying to create a franchise out of a film. Now, Paul Verhoeven entered this movie's set hoping to make a commercially successful blockbuster with a science fiction premise which would also have a social subtext. After Showgirls and Starship Troopers, he had hoped this project would somehow rein in his satirical provocations for the sake of mainstream appeal. But sadly, he didn't achieve that completely. Verhoeven storyboarded over 90% of the film before the shooting began, which one might consider an unusual level of planning. But then it became necessary because of the high cost of altering camera moves mid-production, which cost them about $300,000 per change. Now, all of these camera changes allowed for tight control over visual continuity, yes, but there was barely enough room left for improvisation or spontaneity. In fact, Verhoeven himself described the final movie as an anonymous corporate product instead of his own piece. Perhaps that's the reason why this film had zero subversiveness that we've grown to expect from Verhoeven, and this was noted in the reviews. Everyone noticed that the creative work of the movie is completely confined to the digital special effects, which overshadows its narrative. As a result, you have dramatic incoherence and unconvincing characters who looked like sitcom characters posing as scientists. Bacon delivered a chilling performance, and the visuals remain impressive, but the story is predictable and the reasoning is weak. Verhoeven later expressed how much he regretted the whole film. In fact, in his interviews, he dismissed Hollow Man over and over again as the only one of his American films that he could not defend. For nearly 20 years, he stayed away from Hollywood projects, only to return in 2022 with Young Sinner. In his later interviews, Verhoeven stated that the wound Hollow Man left felt still too fresh, and he found it emotionally difficult to revisit the film. Critics, on the other hand, have revisited this film years later, and this time around, we got more nuanced views instead of just digital effects good and story bad. People pointed out that the sexual power dynamics explored in the movie, along with voyeurism, had Verhoeven's signature written all over it. Some felt that Kane's invisibility aligned with the male gaze's capacity for perversion. These are definitely fresh takes on the movie, but the execution felt like it had no essence behind it. Blog posts argue that even though the director and critics downplayed the significance, the VFX team's work is still significant. It played a huge role in visual storytelling, which urged fans to question if this movie simply failed to channel the bite that Verhoeven's films usually have, or if this movie is just undervalued altogether. On the other hand, the visual effects crew of this film have spoken about this project, and they treat it as one of their most ambitious undertakings. Scott Anderson, the leader of the VFX team, was actually drawn from another film set so that he could design digital humans and coordinate body scans. He praised Bacon's performance in his interviews, stating that it was essential to making the character. Even though he was digitally removed, Kevin Bacon remained the emotional core of the movie. The effects process of the film was no easy feat either. Bacon was painted in different colors for different invisible states. Green for blood, black for water, blue for smoke, along with latex suits, contact lenses, and dental appliances he had to wear at times. All of this was done so that the visual effects team could capture the interactions between Kane, who was invisible, and the environmental elements that surrounded him. Verhoeven tied every visual effect with Bacon's live performance so that the camera movement could merge the actor's presence with CGI as seamlessly as possible. There's no denying that they put so much heart into this movie, but ultimately, it failed. The climax simply felt like horror showmanship, and the ethical and narrative structures simply remained thin. This was Verhoeven's biggest hit since Basic Instinct, but it was also his departure from Hollywood, because this movie is a prime example of the cost of mainstream compromise. And when you combine all those factors, blockbuster ambition, actor intensity, creative exhaustion, and VFX innovation, the film turned out to be a paradox. It was a high-tech achievement, but it exposed the hollow nature of studio mandates. A movie that was so revolutionary to look at, but ethically had nothing to its name. The contradiction present in the film was its defining feature. That's why this movie launched strongly but didn't endure. It made money, yes, but that didn't translate into franchise momentum. There was a tension between the moral emptiness and the dazzling execution. Hollow Man becoming a hit felt almost accidental. And how could it not? I mean, think about it. This movie grossed over $190 million. It might look like a roaring victory at first glance, but it actually wasn't, because these films had aggressive marketing budgets, foreign distribution splits, and back-end deals that drained their profitability. With Hollow Man costing around $95 million to make, and with a return of about $30 to $50 million after paying all the bills, Columbia Pictures wasn't exactly swimming in cash. And back in the day, Hollywood was completely obsessed with IP potential. They didn't want a hit, they wanted something that would give repeated hits. In Hollow Man, the studios got a film that paid its debt but didn't gain enough of a surplus to justify a sequel. According to interviews, the studio actually did consider creating a franchise out of the film, but they were wary about getting into a sequel that would cost nearly as much as the original, but in return, receiving harsher critical returns. This wasn't a risk they were willing to take, and Paul Verhoeven was already checked out. The experience of making Hollow Man under the tight corporate constraints made him feel drained and disillusioned with the Hollywood system. The director, who once gleefully leaned into satire and subversion, had grown frustrated with the studio's emphasis on delivering something mainstream without daring, without risks. The director felt like he was a technician and not an auteur. For all the effort he put into storyboarding and coordinating the VFX, he felt like the masterpiece he created wasn't at all his. So Verhoeven was gone from any of the future projects there might be, and Kevin Bacon had no intention of reprising a character who was thoroughly unlikable and also dead. With that, Columbia Pictures found itself in a bind. They had this really cool world with sci-fi lore, but they had no star, no creator, no goodwill from the critics, and no cultural momentum. This movie was not exactly a movie that people loved. It was a movie that people either tolerated or marveled at for its technical perspective, and that is definitely not the fan enthusiasm you want when you're trying to build this multi-film franchise. But there was one market where Hollow Man did really well: home video. The DVD and VHS sales were brisk, and this was an age where films could make a killing in the rental market even if they had lackluster reviews. According to DVD market reports and box office analytics, this was exactly the case for Hollow Man. It did surprisingly well in rentals, especially for focused markets like horror and science fiction. It wasn't enough to greenlight a theatrical sequel, but it did open a door to cheaper and direct-to-video follow-ups. So, 6 years later, Sony Pictures Home Entertainment gave us a lower-budget continuation that could cash in on the Hollow Man's name without the financial risk associated with a theatrical rollout. The goal was no longer building a universe, they simply wanted to salvage an asset, squeeze a couple more bucks. Now, before we talk about Hollow Man 2, let me make something very clear. There were grounds for a proper sequel to be made. There were ideas that could have made it to the screen. There were murmurs of an ambitious sequel focusing on exploring the other members of the scientific team after the ethical fallout of Sebastian Kane's experiment. People even talked about this new character who might try to replicate the invisibility serum under military pressure, giving us a setting where we would look into defense contracts, government surveillance, and how unchecked tech can be dangerous. But that never happened. Instead, we got a B-movie thriller that barely, and we mean barely, resembled its predecessor. Hollow Man 2 released in 2006 as a direct-to-video title with Christian Slater playing the role of Michael Griffin, a former military assassin turned invisible madman. This time, the invisibility serum wasn't the result of pure science, it was a top-secret military experiment with neurostabilizers and radiation. Peter Fasinelli played a Seattle detective, while Laura Reagan portrayed a biologist who was caught in the crossfire. None of the characters from the original film were mentioned or came back. No Kevin Bacon, no Josh Brolin, no Elizabeth Shue, and definitely no Paul Verhoeven. The production cost of this movie was 1/20th of the original, nearly $5 million. The special effects for this film were handled by less prominent VFX studios with fewer tools and less time. The film tried to mimic some of the visual tricks of the original, but they lacked the polish, horror, and inventiveness of that movie. This one felt like a TV knockoff of the original, and fans could see that. This movie recycled several plot points that were underdeveloped in the original Hollow Man drafts. The screenplay of Hollow Man 2 basically consisted of the unused parts of the first film, especially the militarization of invisibility, the psychological toll of it, and the bioethical implications of creating a human ghost, all patched together. This idea is intriguing on paper, yes, but on screen it devolved into a thriller filled with predictable chases and cookie-cutter characters saying laughably bad dialogue. As you've probably guessed by now, this movie was welcomed with universal disdain. It held a rating of 17% on Rotten Tomatoes, but that number is based on a limited number of reviews because most outlets didn't even bother to cover it. Most user reviews were unforgiving and scathing. This movie felt like someone took the shell of Hollow Man and drained away anything remotely interesting from the movie and gave us the husk. It was screaming nothing. Some users even noted that Christian Slater's performance felt phoned in, and that was the biggest problem for this movie. It had no identity, there was no philosophical edge, no provocative sexuality, no signature violence, no commentary on the dangers of unchecked ambition or the ethics of science. It was just a transparent thriller, pun very much intended. The only connection that it had with the original film was the invisibility serum, which barely held similar emotional or thematic weight. To add even more insult to the injury, this movie didn't even offer any satisfying closure or expansion of the mythology. This film felt like a lazy brand extension. It was a way to exploit recognition without putting in any effort, and when it came out, the DVD market was already shrinking thanks to piracy and streaming. There was no buzz and no demand for more Hollow Man. A lot of people felt like Hollow Man 2 tried to pick up the torches, but ended up burning out in the opening scene. The sequel stripped away everything that was dangerous or fascinating about the original and turned it into a cliché fest. This made the second film completely forgettable. And it's so telling because Christian Slater was a well-known actor back in the day, and even he refused to talk about the film in interviews. The movie doesn't even come up when his career trajectory is discussed. It's not in any retrospectives or on any underrated roles lists. It's almost like Hollow Man 2 was scrubbed clean from pop culture memory the moment it released. And this failure wasn't just a sign of the mediocrity of the film, it had bigger implications. It closed the book on any hopes for a proper franchise. Sony saw the poor response and lack of traction for this movie and made no effort to make a third film or a reboot. In an era where every horror and sci-fi film was being resurrected, Hollow Man was cast aside. And perhaps that was for the best. The idea of invisibility as a horror device is fairly compelling, but Hollow Man never knew what to do with it beyond Pervert Goes Mad, and the sequel was just the nail in the coffin. While the Hollow Man franchise did die, the concept of invisible horror didn't. Blumhouse revisited the idea with The Invisible Man in 2020, which was a sleek and suspenseful reimagining focused on abuse, trauma, and gaslighting. Directed by Leigh Whannell and starring Elizabeth Moss, this movie was financially successful and critically acclaimed. It also proved that invisibility could be used for meaningful storytelling. It did what Hollow Man set out to do without the sexual exploitation of it all. Despite the new Invisible Man movie and love for invisible horror, there were no serious talks about resurrecting Hollow Man. This brand was effectively dead, and for all the technological marvels shown, the original is now an odd artifact. A movie whose impact was only visible for a brief moment. By the time Hollow Man 2 became a part of the forgotten direct-to-DVD sequels, it became very clear that Hollow Man, which was once positioned as a blockbuster with franchise potential, no longer had any future. It's tempting to blame the sequel's failure on the weak production value or the lack of stars returning to the project, but the truth is, Hollow Man was just never built for a franchise. The original film wasn't driven by world building or recurring characters. Unlike Resident Evil, X-Men, or The Matrix, which were franchise juggernauts with their cliffhanger endings and teases of larger mythology, Hollow Man was a self-contained story. It wasn't mythic or mysterious, it was a one-and-done premise with the corruption and moral decay of a man at its core. Once Sebastian Cain turned invisible, went on his little killing spree, and died in the lab's collapse, the story was done. If Sony wanted it to be a franchise, they should have included a narrative pivot, something that would widen the script. Maybe by expanding the military-industrial angle in the first movie, or by implying that the serum would affect different people in different ways. But it did none of that. Hollow Man 2 failed to set up the stakes and regurgitated the same story. A man turns invisible, goes rogue, someone tries to stop him, and murders ensue. There was nothing new. And then there was the prestige problem. Whatever the first film was, despite its flaws, it had the gravitas of a major theatrical release. You had a high-caliber lead actor, a top-tier director, and a big special effects budget. It felt important, even though its content didn't always reflect that. But then the sequel came and it had nothing. There wasn't even any continuity with the events of the first film, so the message that this was not a real sequel was loud and clear. And franchises depend on continuity. They need connections, both narrative and emotional. Kinda like how in the Alien franchise, Ripley just kept coming back as the central anchor, or how in the Terminator franchise, you had different timelines, yes, but there were core characters and themes that grounded it all. However, in Hollow Man, there was no such architecture. After the initial shock wore off, the story was simply gimmicky, and gimmicks cannot sustain a franchise. The franchise also suffered from the shift in market demand. By the mid-2000s, Hollywood was pivoting into superhero dominance. The gritty sci-fi horror hybrids of the 90s were being pushed out by more hopeful or fantastical blockbusters like Spider-Man and The Dark Knight. Invisibility as a power model didn't fit that mold. It didn't have heroism, and it was portrayed as a tool of voyeurism, sociopathic violence, and horror. And without a compelling protagonist or a morally gray hero, Hollow Man did not have a charismatic face that they could hang the brand on. Also, another huge aspect that deserves to be noted is that these invisibility stories, especially in visual mediums like films, are extremely demanding technologically, but narratively limited. The aspects of invisible antagonists that are portrayed visually, like floating objects or footsteps in the dust or silhouettes in steam, get real old real fast, and there's no way to escalate these moments without more violence and spectacle. And violence and spectacle costs money. That's why when the production values dropped, like in the case of Hollow Man 2, the movie simply looked stupid. Verhoeven's original film had ethical and moral questions about hubris, toxic masculinity, and the human tendency to exploit power when there are no consequences. It was uncomfortable, bleak, and dark, but the sequel had none of that. So, the allegorical value of the concept drained with the budget. Invisibility was only used as an action tool, and all the potential depth of the movie was left unexplored, giving the audience nothing to hook onto. Without any intellectual hook or psychological twist, the franchise had nothing differentiating it from other mid-budget thrillers on the shelf. And with the direct-to-DVD release, audiences weren't expecting much. They knew there would be no quality, and that's why this movie was under-promoted by the studios, ignored by critics, and quietly dumped. When we look back today, this movie exists in a weird liminal space. It's not obscure, it was a box office success, had an Oscar nom, and had a major actor attached to it. But it's also not loved by everyone. It doesn't come in the lists of sci-fi or horror movies you must watch. We're not sure we've ever seen any fan tributes to this movie. You don't see cosplay, fanfiction, or reboot petitions for this one because fans just don't revisit it. And when they do, they all say the same thing. The effects are cool, but the movie has no substance. The shallow characters and exploitative tone of the movie are still valid points of criticism. Verhoeven's choice to focus more on the visual spectacle and less on the narration created a movie that's simply bland. This film literally ended Verhoeven's Hollywood run, and the director went back to the European film scene for the next 2 decades, directing smaller personal films like Elle and Black Book. Sure, Elle got Isabelle Huppert an Oscar nom and Verhoeven critical acclaim, but you still gotta wonder, if Hollow Man ended Verhoeven's Hollywood run, then what did it leave behind? If you guessed visual effects that made history, then give yourself a pat on the back. The techniques used in this film were a benchmark for early 2000s digital compositing and motion capture integration. These techniques were later applied to films like Pirates of the Caribbean, Harry Potter, and even Avengers: Infinity War. So in a way, this movie was an invisible pioneer, an unsung hero in the evolution of visual storytelling. Academically, this movie has been discussed by scholars and critics through the lenses of feminist theory, presentations of power, and science ethics. The film's use of the male gaze and turning of the protagonist into an omnipresent voyeur can be examined as a symptom of that era's gender politics. Some argue that Verhoeven used invisibility as unchecked masculine privilege, while others feel that this movie indulged in the toxicity that it claimed to condemn. Hollow Man is a cultural snapshot of the anxieties of the millennium, all wrapped together in one. The fear of government overreach, the corruption of scientific advancement, and the seduction of godlike tech. It wasn't subtle, but it never set out to be. It left behind enough thematic residue to spark conversations even to this day, which is more than enough for a movie that had a lifespan like The Hollow Man. It is, however, very interesting that in an era where studios are clamoring for things to reboot, no one's reaching out to touch The Hollow Man. There's no HBO series or Prime-only movie because this name carries no nostalgia. And with Leigh Whannell's The Invisible Man gaining everything The Hollow Man could not, the fate of Hollow Man was sealed, because that movie showed that Hollow Man chose to use invisibility in the worst ways possible. Leigh Whannell's movie focuses on the victim, while Hollow Man asks you to watch the predator unravel. One movie invoked empathy, while the other invoked indulgence. This difference in perspective is why one film succeeds while the other faded away. Hollow Man was a movie about seeing everything, but it never saw the consequences of its choices. Marvelous verdict! This movie had the tools to become a sci-fi franchise, but instead of indulging in any of that, it focused on spectacle and shock with unconvincing characters, no narrative weight, and zero emotional expansion. This story collapsed after one lousy sequel and was seemingly wiped from the collective memory. The franchise didn't fail because it gave us a bad movie, it failed because no one knew what this franchise wanted to say or what it wanted to be. The invisibility wasn't the problem. The problem was that Hollow Man was not worth a second glance. Let us know your guys' thoughts on Hollow Man in the comments down below, and if you too find Kevin Bacon's Sebastian Cain nightmare fuel like we do. And as always, if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to us if you haven't already. Otherwise, thanks for watching, stay safe out there, and have a marvelous day.